Hi everybody, can you all hear me? I'm a little sick today, so my voice is not 100%. If you get sick after the conference, you know who to blame? Okay, cool, thank you. All right, so hi everybody, as Peggy said, I'm Shruti Kapoor. I'm a senior software engineer at PayPal. At PayPal, we work with 3 technologies very extensively: GraphQL, React, and JavaScript. And I'm super passionate about these 3 technologies. But more than that, I'm passionate about dev jokes. And because tomorrow is Halloween, Halloween edition dev jokes. So I'm going to say out questions and you can say out the answers. Hey, officer, how did the hackers escape? That's pretty good. But they just ran somewhere. Why do programmers get confused between Halloween and Christmas? Because 31st octal equals 25 decimal. Did you hear about the witch who was off by 2 when casting a hex? They failed to make the target dead and made them deaf instead. So if you want to learn more dev jokes, go to GitHub. All right, let's get started. So I'm going to be talking about state management using React hooks. By the way, all the slides are available on Twitter. If they're not published yet, I'll go publish them right after this. My goal by this presentation is to help you draw the link between hooks, GraphQL, and data, and how to think in terms of data for your state management needs. I want to give you my learnings and so that you can start experimenting with React hooks in your own project. By the end of this presentation, my goal is that you should be able to manage your application state in a predictable manner without the need of any third-party package. So here's the outline of today. I'm going to be talking about different types of state. I'll give you a brief introduction of hooks. We'll talk about how to use React hooks along with GraphQL APIs. We'll talk about Apollo and hooks and the new Apollo hooks. So let's first talk about what are the different types of state. There's 2 different types of state in a UI application. There's global state and local state. Let's look at each of them. So global state, as the name suggests, is the state that exists throughout the application. It's typically the application state. This is the state that all the components need within their application to manage data. Here's an example of a UI. So when a user logs in, the authorization is a perfect example of global state. When a user logs in, you want to change maybe the welcome message. You want to show a list of the users they have, a list of friends they have. So that is global state. That state exists throughout the application. On the other side, there is local state. And as the name suggests, it is state that is only local to component logic. A very good example of that is like forms. So when you enter something, maybe you want to show a help text. And that logic you only want to keep in the form. So that's only local to the form. Hence, it is a local state. Now let's look at different ways of managing state. So currently, there's a bunch of ways we can manage state. There's React component state that comes natively, Context API, Redux, which is super popular, MobX state tree, hooks that is super new, and Apollo client. Today, we're going to dive in deeper into hooks. So how many of you have used hooks or are using hooks in production? Awesome, that's great to see. So hooks was actually proposed in October 2018, just a year ago, and released 4 months later. It is now stable in React 16.8, and most of you are already using it, so that's great to know. But what is hooks? So according to Dan, hooks are actually a more direct explanation of React, such as state, lifecycle, and context. So it's a more intuitive way of thinking of React. And we no longer have to think in terms of lifecycle methods like component did update, component did mount. We don't have to worry when React is rendering, but now we can worry about the data and how the data flows within our application. But why do we need hooks? Well, the truth is that state management is a hard problem. We often overcomplicate our state management solution. There's tons of libraries out there. We don't know if we should use Redux for our form component, or we should build the entire thing in Context API. Should we add MobX? But I only have a form. Do I need a form library? My data needs to be offline. What the fuck do I do? What is a service worker? What the heck is a Redux saga? Honestly, the first time I was learning this in my first year out of college, this is what I felt like. So let's look at some solutions that have worked pretty well. For example, Redux. Redux, it's really good and it's really popular because it has this magical connect function, which once you use, your data is available everywhere. So you can share data across different parts of your application simply by using a connect function. But the bad problem of this is that all of the state, whether you're local and global, is in the same store. And what we started noticing was that developers were often using Redux store to even use for the local state. Now let's look at Context Provider. So the good part about Context Provider is that it lifts state up to the very top component, and that's why we don't have a problem of prop drilling. But the bad part is that once a context provider updates, all of the components that are using the value also re-render. So if you have one context provider at the top, all of your children components will update. Now let's look at how hooks is solving some of that problem. The first problem is of prop drilling. Hooks is solving that by lifting state up. So you can use useState and useContext, extract out your state, and put it wherever you need, so you don't need to pass in props anymore. The second problem that comes with Redux especially is boilerplate. With hooks, it's super easy because you can just use state without having the class component. Now hooks is available out of function components, so you don't need to refactor anything. And context reload. So with hooks, you won't have this problem because you can keep your state close. And to have your state more logically separated, you can put it in the React tree closer to where it matters. Now let's look at 4 hooks that we're going to use in our application. So the 4 hooks that I found very helpful was useEffect, useReducer, useContext, and useState. Now first, let's look at useState. So useState is the hook that replaces this.state. It is used for sharing data amongst components, and it's I feel like it's the most simplest hook. It is used to initialize state. So an example here is, let's say if you want to use count, we can simply do count and set count, initialize it by 0. Here's another example of how we can use it. So if we want to update set count or we want to update count, we can just call the set count function. It's just a simple function. Here's an example of a to-do list that my fiance gives me. So useState is simple. It can either take a constant function, a constant variable, or it can even take objects. So here we have passed in objects. And if we want to update this list of to-do list, we can simply call set things he says and update it to another object. One thing I find really cool about hooks is that you can use multiple hooks together. So I can just create a today's nag list and use the counter and the to-do list to return things he says and count. So I've made a custom hook here. Now let's look at React hooks useEffect. So useEffect is the hook that is used to update DOM. It's used to do any side effect or effectful code. And it's similar to component did mount, and it can also do the cleanup function for component did unmount. So it's a very handy function. So here's an example. So let's say we want to update the title of document. We can use the useEffect hook, and we'll put our effectful code within useEffect. So we'll use document.title and update the code. Here's another way we can use subscriptions within useEffect. So we can simply call our subscribe to friend status function within useEffect. And if you want to unsubscribe or do the cleanup, we can do that in the return function. So this way we're doing the functions of both component did mount and component did will unmount. We looked at useEffect and useState. Now let's look at useContext and useReducer. So if you're familiar with the context API, the provider method and the consumer method, useContext will seem very simple for you. So with UseContext, we can simply do UseContext, provide an initial value of context, and consume the value. One caveat though is that UseContext can only be used to read context, but to provide a context, you still need the provider method. The next is useReducer. If you're familiar with Redux, useReducer is very similar. It passes back a dispatch function and provides back a state variable in addition to the dispatch function. So the 4 hooks that we looked at were useEffect, useReducer, useContext, and useState. Now we're going to build a real-ish app. I've put the links here. If you want to open it up, I'll give you a minute. Okay, so if you open the link, this is the code sandbox example of this. So it's a very typical UI. There's a form at the top here, name, artist, lyrics. What it does is it renders a list of songs that I like on the page. So it's kind of like my personal music player or music list. So I have a bunch of songs here. So the first thing that this app does when you load the page is query the GraphQL API and fetch for this list of songs. Once it's fetched the list of songs, it will start displaying it here. And this form function, this form is actually a mutation. So if we add a song here, it will put it in the GraphQL API. So I'm going to add a song here. And give me a beat. Let's try that again. I don't think that's working. Anyways. That's my rap song. Okay, so I added the song. I should come up here. My song is here. So that's the mutation component. Now, let's this application is built using hooks. So I'm going to walk through how to build this application using hooks. So I have the recipe right here. Is this big enough? All right, so the first thing we're going to do is initialize our state. So we're going to go to home.js and start with, app.js and start with an initial state. I'm going to use the useContext hook to provide it a basic context and initialize my state. The next thing is I'm going to call useReducer with the initial state. So I'm going to call useReducer with the state that I passed in here, and it gives me back a state and a dispatch function. The next thing I'm going to do is figure out which top level component should have context and set up context. So here I'm going to say my home component would have my context. So I'm going to provide my context right here, and then I'm going to pass the state and dispatch that I got from useReducer into this context provider. So here is an example where you can actually have multiple components and multiple context providers. So I could have something like, let's say I want add song to have a different context. Or let's say if I have a login component, I want to give a different context to it, I can totally do that. And then this home would not have the same context as this. So this way I can separate my context so that whenever context reloads, home doesn't reload. I'll get rid of this for now. Okay, so I've passed in my state and dispatched the context, and now my home will have access to this context. The next thing I want to do is pass in the dispatch return from useReducer to the context provider so that children have access to dispatch. I did that right here. Then hook up GraphQL API to a component using useEffect. So I'm going to say that my home function right here would have access to the GraphQL query. So this is my query. I'm asking for artist, name, and lyrics, which is the one that we see on the form. And here, I'm going to use the useEffect hook to dispatch and add content with the payload of songs. So what happens is, the first time you load the page, the query is called, and the useEffect is fired up after the UI is rendered, and it will dispatch an add content reducer to let the UI know that songs have updated. Then we're going to use UseContext and UseReducer to receive and update global application state. So what I'm going to do is, anytime I need to update this state, I will use useEffect or I'll use UseContext or UseReducer. So if I go to add song, here I have this name, artist, and lyrics fields right here in my form. So this is where all the mutation magic happens. So I have this field name, artist, and lyrics. So once I fire the submit button, it calls this add song mutation with these variables, name, artist, and lyrics. And once I fired that, I want to update my local state, for which I will use the useState hook, which is set name, set lyrics, and artist, and initialize it back to blank. And then the last thing is, if you want to use local state, just use useState. So that's using React hooks. Now, I'm still using Apollo's mutation or a component here. So what I want to do next is update this mutation component to the React hooks. So for that, by the way, if you want to follow along, I have these example on my GitHub, GraphQL Summit 2019, and you can go to the branch custom hooks or Apollo hooks to follow along. So now I have this mutation component right here, but I want to update it to hooks. So what I'll do is, so I'm going to first bring in use mutation from Apollo React hooks right here, and then I'm going to use add song mutation, which I have already in my mutation list, and then everything remains the same. I don't need to change anything. The only difference here is that initially it was a render prop method, but now it's a much cleaner hook. So that's use mutation. Now if I want to update use query as well, what I can do is I can remove it from here. I used to have it right here. I have this query function here. Now I can remove that, remove the query from here, and use the hook here. So again, import it from React hooks, use query here, pass in the song, and then the use query will give you data loading in error, and you can use data simply the same way you were using before. No change there. Okay, now let's say we want to add another functionality here. Let's say we want that once we add an artist, we also want to show related songs. So for that, we can make a custom React hook. So let's see how to do that. So I'm going to go to my song item component. These are all song items. So here I have this component, and I'm going to make a new query, new custom hook, use related songs. So let's look at use related songs. So for use related songs, I'm doing another query, get related songs from my new client. By the way, here's how you can have 2 or more clients in your API, in your application. If you have a GraphQL API that you want to use, which is different than the GraphQL API you're already using, you can use another custom client, pass in the new URL for the GraphQL endpoint, and pass it into your use query because it accepts a client as an optional variable. So this way you can have more than 2 GraphQL APIs. All right, so we have this new custom hook here, use related songs, and then we're going to make a query, get related songs, and pass in the name of the artist here, and get ID, name, album, and URL. So once we have use related songs here, once we get the data back, I'm going to just return the data and export default my use related songs. This is how I have a custom hook. Now I just have to use this hook, so I'll go back to song item, and I have use related hooks right here. I'm getting the data back. Now once I have the data, all I have to do is just loop through it. So I'm going to make another component, more songs, and this component basically just loops through the data. So now what I do is if I have, let's say, Shawn Mendes, let's say I want to see more songs related to Shawn Mendes, I just click on this button and I got these other songs. So that's how we can use custom hooks and Apollo's React hooks to make an application with state management. Okay, so to briefly recap, we used a useQuery and useMutation hook. We changed the mutation vendor prop to a hook, useMutation, and similarly with the query, we changed the GraphQL query into a useQuery hook. So I have all the slides on GitHub, on my GitHub GraphQL Summit 2019, and that's all I have for you today. But if you want to work on GraphQL, React, and Gatsby, PayPal is hiring. And we have made a new blog post on how to use PayPal and how we're using GraphQL at PayPal. So if you want to check it out, please go do that. I want to leave with the last dev joke. Thank you very much.